My daughter boasted that her spouse fixed me, while I took my seat at the table with a fractured arm. The smell of roast duck with apples hung thick in the dining room, rich and buttery, the kind of scent that usually meant celebration. To Dr. Lorna Price, it meant something else entirely. She sat at the head of the table she had presided over for decades, in the house she and her late husband had paid off brick by brick. Her plate, fine china with a delicate gold rim, was perfectly clean. Around her wrist, however, was not gold but white plaster. Her right arm rested uselessly in a heavy cast, fingers swollen and tinged with yellow and purple. The bone had snapped with a sound she would never forget. It wasn't the first time she'd heard that sound. She had once been a neurosurgeon and knew fractures the way musicians know notes. This one had not come from a fall. It had come from force. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. On her left, her son-in-law Dwayne lounged in the chair that had always belonged to her husband. He had unbuttoned his charcoal suit jacket and sprawled like a minor king, his knife carving crude trenches through the duck before shoveling huge pieces into his mouth. Grease shone on his chin, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, laughing too loudly, drinking too fast. Guests from the city office sat along the sides of the table, 2 men and a woman, forks moving mechanically, eyes down, pretending not to see the empty plate in front of their host. They saw the cast. They knew exactly what they were pretending not to know. "Come on, don't be shy," Dwayne boomed, raising his glass in the stale air. "My wife outdid herself. This duck is next level." He tore into another piece and glanced at Lorna with a lazy, mocking smile. "Mama Lorna's on a cleanse today. Fasting clears the mind, right?" His eyes had that glassy gleam she recognized too well. Liquor and petty power mixed together. One of his subordinates, a young man in glasses, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should fix Ms. Price a plate," he murmured without lifting his gaze. "She hasn't." "Stay in your lane, Malik," Dwayne cut in, his voice dropping. "Doctor's on a special diet. Doctor's orders." He tilted his head toward her. "Isn't that so, Mama? You get confused when you eat too much at night." The laughter that followed from the guests sounded brittle, like glass about to crack. To Dwayne's right, Lorna's daughter Tiana sat in a beige dress that washed the color right out of her face. Her knife moved with careful precision, slicing cucumbers into thin circles as if she were performing delicate work. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at the cast. "It was an accident," Tiana said quietly after a long beat, her gaze fixed on her plate. "Mama tried to climb up to the attic like she was 30, and she slipped. We've told her it's not safe, but she won't listen." Her voice trembled, but it wasn't grief Lorna heard. It was fear. Fear for her own place in this house, for the image she and her husband had built. Lorna's stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it made her lightheaded. She had not eaten since the evening before. The pain in her arm throbbed in rhythm with the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, a clock her father had once polished every Sunday. Tick, tock, tick, tock. After so many years in operating rooms, Lorna had trained herself to treat pain and fear like background noise. She focused on details instead, the way Dwayne's guests kept their shoulders tight, the way her daughter's knife slowed whenever Lorna's name was mentioned, the way every eye darted toward the empty plate, then away again. Dwayne lifted his glass high. "To order," he declared. "Every house needs a chain of command. Whoever pays the bills calls the shots. Whoever's living on someone else's dime learns to stay in their lane." He swallowed the cognac in one gulp and wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, then tossed his fork onto the table where it clattered next to the untouched dessert plate in front of Lorna. That sound seemed to click something into place inside her. The hot swirl of humiliation and rage cooled into something else, steady, icy, familiar. It was the same feeling that used to settle over her right before a dangerous surgery. Emotions were noise. Precision required silence. She lifted her head and looked at the clock. 7:59. Almost 8. "Dwayne," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the room heard it. When a woman who has spent her life giving orders in an operating theater speaks like that, people listen. Even the silverware was still there. Dwayne froze mid-bite, then turned his head, amusement pulling at his lips. "What do you need, Mama?" he drawled. "Some more water? A nicer attitude." "You are sitting in my husband's chair," she said calmly. "And by my count, you have 1 minute left to enjoy it." For a second, confusion flickered in his eyes. Then he threw back his head and barked out a laugh, thick with liquor. "Hear that?" he said to the guests. "Dr. Price is on a schedule. Go ahead, Mama, count it down. 59. 58. He kept laughing, but she returned her gaze to the clock. The second hand crept steadily toward the 12. She knew exactly what would happen when it reached it. The quiet in the apartment was not surrender. It was a countdown. Her mind slipped back 24 hours, to the moment that had brought them all here. The memory came in sharp, clean frames, like an X-ray. The night before, the apartment had smelled not of roast duck, but of stale alcohol and sweat. Dwayne had paced the living room like a caged animal, phone in hand, tie hanging loose around his neck. "You think I'm playing?" he shouted, his voice bouncing off the walls. "These people are not patient, Lorna. I need that deed. I need that condo. Tonight." His eyes were wild, his breath sour, his hands shaking. Lorna had stood in the doorway to her bedroom, blocking his path. "This home is in my name," she replied, steady but tired. "Your gambling debts are not my obligation. I will not sign anything." She had treated men with worse wounds than his pride. She had stared down tumors pressing against vital centers of the brain. She did not flinch now. That was her mistake. Not the refusal, but the assumption that she was still dealing with a man who could be reasoned with. His panic, fed by threats from people she would never meet, broke through whatever thin layer of decency he once possessed. He lunged. The shove was sudden, all his weight thrown behind it. She flew backward. Her hand came up instinctively to shield her face from the doorframe. The crack of bone meeting would shot through her like lightning. She hit the floor struggling for breath, clutching her arm to her chest. The pain roared through her like fire. Tiana had stood in the hallway, frozen, eyes wide. She had seen everything. She had heard everything. Yet instead of rushing to her mother, she pressed her hands to her cheeks and whispered, "Mama, why do you always provoke him? Just sign the papers. Please." Dwayne had yanked the landline cord out of the wall with one tug, then dug her phone from her pocket and pocketed it himself. "No calls," he'd spat. "Think it over. The notary comes tomorrow. You sign, we're good. You don't sign, I'll make sure you end up in a home drooling on yourself. Everyone listens to me in this city. You know that." Then he had locked her bedroom door, leaving her on the floor in the dark, her arm broken, her world suddenly very small. But Lorna had not spent a lifetime inside hospitals for nothing. Panic was a luxury surgeons could never afford. With her good hand, she had dragged herself to the bottom of an old wardrobe and pulled out a worn leather bag she had not touched in years. Inside lay what she needed, an ampoule of pain medicine, a syringe, and an old prepaid phone she'd always kept charged out of habit. She had injected herself, assembled the phone, and powered it on. The screen flickered to life. She knew better than to call the local police chief. Dwayne played cards with him most weekends. This situation needed someone who moved above small-town favors and barroom agreements. Behind the pain, memory sparked. She dialed a number she had never written down but had never truly forgotten. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, a man's voice answered. Deep. Controlled. "Yes. It's Lorna Price," she said. Her teeth chattered from shock, not fear. "I need help." There was a short silence, heavy with years. Then, "Where are you?" No surprise, no commentary, no nostalgia. Just the clipped readiness of a man used to giving orders and expecting them to be obeyed. She gave him the address. "Hold on," he said. Then the line went dead. Now, back in the dining room, The grandfather clock began to chime at 8 o'clock. As the last chime faded, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the room, long and insistent, rattling the glass in the cabinets. Dwayne smirked as he pushed back from the table and stood, smoothing the front of his rumpled shirt. "Right on time," he announced, swaggering toward the hallway. "That'll be the notary. Family business never waits." Tiana sagged with visible relief, reaching for her wine. "Mama, just sign," she murmured. "Please. Don't make this worse." Lorna rested her left hand on the arm of her chair. The pain in her right arm pulsed, but it no longer controlled her. The second hand on the clock ticked steadily on. The mechanisms she had set in motion last night were every bit as precise as the gears turning under that clock face. Dwayne strode down the hall and pulled open the door with theatrical warmth. "Come on in, my man," he boomed. "Got the papers? The old lady's finally ready to do what's right." His voice stopped mid-word. Not fading, not trailing off, just cut off, as if someone had pinched the sound out of existence. For a few beats, there was no sound at all. Then Lorna heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps crossing the foyer. The measured thud of boots that did not belong to a nervous notary. The countdown was over. Her guest had arrived. The first person into the dining room was not Dwayne, not the notary, not anyone who belonged to that house at all. Two tall men in dark tactical clothing stepped through the doorway and took up positions on either side, one by the wall of family photographs and one near the china cabinet. They moved with the disciplined stillness she recognized from operating on soldiers long ago. Men trained to react faster than conscious thought. Their presence squeezed the air out of the room. Then Dwayne stumbled in backward, his bravado gone. His complexion had turned a chalky gray, and his eyes kept flickering toward the hallway as if unable to process what he'd seen. "Everyone on your feet," he babbled, clapping his hands too fast. "Stand up. We have an honored guest." He tugged at his collar with shaking fingers. "Governor Hale, sir, this is unexpected." Governor Marcus Hale entered as if the apartment were a public stage he had stepped onto 1,000 times before. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that made his broad shoulders and straight posture even more imposing. His hair had gone silver since the last time she had seen him, and there were new lines etched around his eyes, but the gaze itself hadn't changed. It still cut straight through pretense, weighing and classifying without lingering. What stunned the table most, however, was not his title or the men at his back, but what he carried. In one hand, he held a small bouquet of wild blue hydrangeas, hastily tied with a simple piece of twine. The delicate petals looked almost absurd against the sharp lines of his suit. Yet he held them gently, as if they were the only thing in the room that mattered. Dwayne lurched forward, desperate for a handshake. "Governor Hale, sir, welcome, welcome. If I'd known you were coming, we'd have prepared something more." Marcus Hale walked right past him. He didn't pause or glance left or right. To him, Dwayne was no more than a piece of furniture in his path. He walked straight to the head of the table. Straight to Lorna. For a heartbeat no one moved. The governor's eyes took in the scene with clinical precision. The spread of food, the half-empty bottles, the untouched plate in front of Lorna, the heavy cast on her arm, the way her fingers protruded stiff and swollen from the plaster. A muscle jumped in his jaw. The expression on his face was not theatrical anger. It was cold, controlled fury, the kind that gathers power before it breaks. He stopped next to her chair. The room held its breath. Then, to the stunned amazement of everyone present, he lowered himself down onto one knee beside her. The expensive cloth of his suit brushed the hardwood floor, and he didn't bother to dust it off. He set the hydrangeas gently on the table by her empty plate and laid his large hand over her good one. His palm was warm. His fingers, though strong, were careful, mindful of her age and injury. "Dr. Price," he said softly, his deep voice filling the room without effort. It had been decades since she had last heard that voice. Back then he'd been Sergeant Hale, a young man with a bullet fragment lodged dangerously near his brain. She had stood over him in the operating room, gloved hands steady, trusting her skill to keep him alive. Now he was the one kneeling. "You told my office you tripped," he continued quietly. "You said it was a simple fall." His eyes flicked to her empty plate, then to the duck, then back to her. His tone didn't rise, but something in it hardened. "You didn't mention you were gone all day without food." Dwayne shifted, barking out a nervous laugh. "Governor, sir, that's just... well, it's not exactly." The governor rose to his feet in one smooth motion. He pulled out the high-backed chair that had belonged to Lorna's late husband and rested his hand on it. He still had not looked at Dwayne. His gaze stayed on Lorna and her cast. The silence stretched. Dwayne cleared his throat. "Of course, sir," he stuttered suddenly, backing away. "Please, have a seat. I was just keeping it warm for you." He stumbled sideways, almost knocking over Tiana's chair as he scrambled away. The shape of the room shifted. The man who had strutted there minutes ago now clung to the edges. Governor Hale sank into the chair with the easy authority of someone who did not need to prove his right to a place. One of his security men stepped forward, swift and silent, and set a gleaming travel set of utensils in front of him. The governor moved the greasy fork and knife that Dwayne had been using aside with the slightest curl of his finger, as one might push aside something distasteful. He reached for the platter in the middle of the table and drew it near as if it weighed nothing. With practiced control, he cut a slice of duck, then began to divide it into small, careful pieces, smaller than any adult would need, small enough for someone whose dominant hand was unusable, or whose strength had been drained by pain and hunger. The guests watched as his knife traced quiet lines through the meat, carving order into the chaos left behind. Lorna's throat tightened. She had fed hundreds of patients who woke groggy and disoriented after surgery, hands shaking, muscles weak. She knew what it meant to be treated like a burden, and she knew how quickly a kind gesture could restore dignity. Here, in her own home, she was the one who had been reduced to an object of control. Yet this man, this governor, was preparing her dinner like a son honoring an elder, not like a politician paying a favor. He turned back to her with a forkful of duck. There was no pity in his eyes, only respect and a quiet anger that wasn't aimed at her. "Please," he said. "Eat." For a moment, shame prickled under her skin. To be fed in front of those who had watched her starve felt almost like another humiliation. But the way he held the fork, steady, unhurried, as if nothing about the situation was strange, made a different feeling rise in her chest. She opened her mouth, and he placed the piece gently between her lips. The meat was hot, the skin crisp, and the apples sweet. The sudden flood of flavor made her dizzy. She swallowed slowly, feeling her body seize on the nourishment like a starving child. He waited, then gave her another piece. And another. The guests stayed frozen in their seats, eyes wide. No one dared interrupt. Even Tiana sat motionless, her face pale, mascara clinging stubbornly to her lashes. Only when Lorna's hands stopped trembling and the sharpest edge of hunger dulled did Governor Hale set down the fork. He folded the napkin over his knee and reached for a glass of water. He turned the glass once in his hand, the crystal catching the light. When he spoke next, his voice was still soft, but the softness was gone from his eyes. "I have one question," he said. The words landed like a gavel strike. "Who in this room believes they taught Dr. Price a lesson?" The tremor that passed through Dwayne was visible, even from across the table. His mouth twitched into something that was supposed to be a smile. "Governor, sir, that's just a figure of speech," he said, trying and failing to sound casual. Sweat rolled along his hairline. "Families say things. My mother-in-law is... well, she's older now. Coordination isn't good. She fell. We were terrified. I almost called an ambulance, but she insisted she was fine. We take excellent care of her, I promise you. Don't we, Tiana?" Tiana flinched at the sound of her name, then bobbed her head up and down too quickly. "Of course," she whispered. We love her. She just gets confused and..." Her voice faded out under the weight of the governor's gaze. Lorna chewed her last bite slowly, forcing herself not to rush. When she emptied her mouth, she set her left hand gently on the table. "Dwayne," she said, her voice steadier now. "Tell the governor about the stairs." He seized on the idea like a drowning man grabbing a floating branch. "Yes, exactly," he rattled, nodding. "The stairs. She went for water last night and missed a step. Fell down the flight. Freak accident. That's how these injuries happen. Textbook." A tense, brittle silence settled around them. The lie hovered in the air, flimsy and obvious. Lorna held his gaze for 2 slow heartbeats, then turned to the governor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "There are no stairs in this apartment," she said with precision, as though reciting a line of a medical chart. "It is a single-level unit. All thresholds were removed when my husband's knees went bad. You know that, Marcus. You signed the grant that paid for the renovations." The effect was immediate. The smile slipped off Dwayne's face as if someone had wiped it away with a cloth. The color drained from his cheeks. The woman from the city office lowered her eyes sharply, as if hoping not to be called on next. Malik pressed his lips together so tightly his nostrils flared. Governor Hale lifted his glass of water, then set it down untouched. He glanced at one of his security officers, a tall man with a hard, unreadable face. "Major," he said, voice like iron, "get the district attorney on the line. We'll need a full review of Deputy Director Dwayne Carter's activities over the last 5 years. All contracts. All payouts. All accounts." "Yes, sir," the major replied, already drawing a phone from his pocket as he stepped discreetly toward the hallway. Dwayne stumbled forward, voice rising in panic. "Governor, that's not necessary," he blurted, his words tumbling out. "We're colleagues, you and me. We keep this city running. This is just a misunderstanding. Domestic stuff. Stress. You know how it is." But the governor did not look at him. He had seen enough families to understand that domestic stuff could cover almost anything. On the table, near Lorna's elbow, her old leather bag rested where Tiana had placed it earlier that day, too frightened to open it. Inside it lay something even more dangerous than a broken bone. Proof. "Bring me your mother's bag," Governor Hale said quietly, his gaze never leaving Dwayne's face. Tiana jerked at the sound of his voice, then hesitated, eyes darting from her husband to her mother. When neither spoke, she pushed back her chair and hurried to the hallway, returning with the worn leather satchel clutched in both hands. She set it down on the table as if it might explode. "Open the inner pocket," Lorna instructed. Her tone was calm and professional, the way she had once told nurses where to place instruments. "The large envelope. You saw it this morning but didn't touch it. Take it out." Tiana's fingers trembled as she unzipped the pocket. She drew out a thick, yellowed envelope. Dwayne laughed shakily. "It's nothing," he said too quickly. "Probably some old test results. Age, you know. Bones get fragile." Governor Hale took the envelope from Tiana and slid the contents free. A single X-ray film slipped out, glossy and dark. He lifted it toward the chandelier. Light filtered through crystalline film, illuminating the white outline of Lorna's forearm bones. Everyone at the table could see it clearly, a harsh line where there should have been smooth continuity. Dwayne surged back into speech, scrambling to fill the silence. "See. There it is," he said, trying to sound knowledgeable. "Classic fall fracture." She put her hand out, caught herself wrong. "Happens all the time." The governor lowered the film slowly. His jaw tightened. "I served in the army before any of you knew my name," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I have seen falls from rooftops, from trucks, down ravines. I've seen what a wrist looks like when someone hits the ground hands first. That's one pattern." He tapped the part of the bone where a fall would usually leave its mark. Then he moved his finger to the site of Lorna's fracture, halfway up the radius. "This is another." No one spoke. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. "This break," he continued, holding the film so the table could see, is what you see when someone raises an arm to shield their head. A blow comes down. The bone takes it. Soldiers call it a defensive fracture. Doctors call it what it is, a record of violence. He returned the film to the table. It slid, face down, into a bowl of potatoes and disappeared beneath a layer of butter and herbs. He turned his head slightly toward the major in the doorway. "The audit begins now," he said. "Have your people check the basement of this building as well. Paperwork says, storage space. I want to know what it's actually holding." Dwayne's breathing sped up. His pupils dilated. "You can't just investigate me because my mother-in-law tripped," he burst out. "I have rights." "You do," the governor replied. "You also have a pattern, from what I've seen. And patterns leave trails." The major retreated to the hall, murmuring into his phone. A few minutes later, a faint buzz sounded on the governor's own device. He glanced down, scanned the screen, and let out a small, humorless exhale. "Well," he said. "That didn't take long." Tension coiled tighter around the table. "The basement," he went on, speaking more to the room than to Dwayne now, "is registered as janitorial storage. In reality, my people are standing in front of stacked crates of counterfeit handbags, untaxed cigarettes, stolen electronics, and more. All tucked neatly under the feet of a retired surgeon whose name has cleared more charts than you've signed forms, Mr. Carter." Dwayne's face twisted. "You don't understand," he shouted suddenly. "Do you think I wanted it like this? I had no choice. You know how it is in this city. People higher up expect favors. You either play along, or you get crushed. I'm a victim here too." Lorna watched him with a strange detachment. She'd seen patients justify their smoking with the stress of their jobs. She'd seen families explain away bruises on a child as rough play. She recognized every excuse. None of them changed the X-ray. He spun toward her, desperation flaring. "Tell him, Mama Lorna," he pleaded. "Tell him you get confused sometimes. Tell him it was an accident. We can fix this. We're all family." "No," she said simply. Something wild sparked in Dwayne's eyes. He slammed his fist on the table, making plates jump and silverware clatter. "This is my house," he shouted. "Mine. I pay for the bills. I put food on this table." He thrust a finger at her, his voice rasping. "Without me, you'd be in some cheap nursing home. You're nothing without my support. Do you hear me? Nothing." He lunged around the table, instinctively aiming for the same space he'd invaded the night before. Lorna didn't flinch, but the security officers moved in a blur, hands hovering near holsters. They needn't have bothered. Governor Hale was already on his feet. He stepped into Dwayne's path, his presence alone enough to halt the charge. He didn't raise his voice or his hand. He simply looked down at Dwayne with a gaze so cold the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Sit," he said, the single word carrying the weight of all the authority he had ever held. The fight leaked out of Dwayne as if a plug had been pulled. He staggered backward and collapsed onto the floor, landing heavily on the hardwood. He clutched at the edge of the table as though it might anchor him. Panic spun wildly in his eyes. "The property you've been bragging about," Lorna said into the silence that followed, "doesn't belong to you." He stared at her, blinking, sweat shining on his forehead. "What are you talking about?" he whispered hoarsely. "Tiana is my wife. She's an only child. When you die, this apartment is hers. That's how inheritance works." Lorna nodded to the governor. "Marcus," she said, "the red folder, please. The one from the hospital archives." The major returned, placing a thin red folder embossed with a faded city seal into Governor Hale's hand. He set it in front of Lorna, and she opened it with her left hand, smoothing the single sheet of official paper inside. "You hurt me," she said quietly. "For this apartment. You locked me in my room, ripped out the phones, and starved me, all to force my signature onto a deed. You thought you were breaking an old woman's resistance. She rotated the document so Dwayne could see the letterhead, the signatures, the date. What you never did was check the registry. His eyes scanned the top lines, then froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. This, she continued, tapping the page, is a deed of gift. 10 years ago, I donated this apartment to the charitable foundation that supports the city hospital, in honor of my husband and my years of service. The only condition is that I have the right to live here for the rest of my life. I own no property you can inherit. When I die, this place reverts to the foundation. Tiana made a strangled sound. You gave away the apartment, she whispered. You never told me. You never asked, Lorna replied, her gaze steady. You only assumed. All of this, she gestured faintly toward the walls, the polished floor, the chandelier, was never yours to take. You broke my arm over something that legally does not belong to you. For a moment, the world seemed to turn on its side for Dwayne. Whatever fragile scaffolding he had built from debts, favors, bribes, and lies toppled in an instant. The condo he had already mentally sold, the money he had already spent in his imagination, the illusion of safety he'd always believed he could wrestle from other people's assets, all of it evaporated. The sound that came from his throat was not quite human. He slumped further down until he was kneeling, then scrambling, then crawling over the polished floor, dragging his expensive suit like a collapsed banner. He grabbed at the legs of Lorna's chair, leaving damp streaks on the wood. Dr. Price. Mama, please, he sobbed, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I was stupid, desperate. They're going to kill me if I don't pay. You don't understand what kind of people these are. Help me. Ask the governor to help. Tell him I'm not a bad man. I just made mistakes. I'll do anything. I'll serve you hand and foot. Just save me. Before she could answer, he twisted around, dragging someone else into his panic. It was her idea, he cried, jabbing a finger toward his wife without looking at her. Tiana started it. She said you were old, that you didn't need such a big place, that we could invest the money. She kept pushing. The clatter of metal on porcelain cut him off. Tiana's fork had slipped from her hand and hit her plate. She stared at her husband in disbelief and horror. Then something inside her snapped, and she stumbled forward, falling to her knees next to him, shoving at his shoulder to get nearer to her mother. Mama, he's lying, she insisted, grabbing for Lorna's good hand. Her voice came out thick with tears. You know how he is. He scared me. He threatened me. I was going to call the police, but he pulled the cord. I wanted to help you, I swear. He said he'd hurt us both if I interfered. I'm your daughter. Your baby. You can't believe him over me. Lorna looked down at the two figures clinging to her chair. One she had never chosen. The other she had carried for 9 months, fed, soothed, disciplined, comforted. She had watched her first steps, her first day of school, her first heartbreak. She had worked nights and weekends to pay for those beige dresses and the education that came before them. Somewhere along the way, the thread between them had frayed. She gently pulled her hand free from her daughter's grasp. The motion was not harsh, but it was absolute. No, she said, and Tiana's face crumpled. I remember everything about last night, Lorna continued, her words calm but sharp. I remember lying on the floor with my arm broken. I remember you standing over me. You weren't crying. You weren't reaching for the phone. You leaned close and told me to be quiet. You were worried the neighbors would hear and call someone. Not because you were afraid for my life, but because you didn't want a scandal on your husband's record. Tiana's shoulders sagged. The color drained from her face. On some level, she knew there was no defense against that truth. You had a choice, Lorna said. You could have chosen me, or you could have chosen comfort. You chose him. You chose silence. The small vibration of a phone on the table broke the hush that had descended. Governor Hale picked up his device, his thumb swiping across the screen. He read the message, and one corner of his mouth twitched upward, more in grim confirmation than satisfaction. "Deputy Director Carter," he said, looking up at Dwayne with a cool, evaluating gaze. "It turns out your debts are the least of your problems. The financial review shows embezzlement flagged in multiple projects: sidewalk repairs, elevator refurbishments, insulation upgrades. And that basement operation? The suppliers you've been protecting are tied into larger networks. You didn't just get in over your head. You started swimming in water where sharks live." Dwayne sagged against the leg of the chair, eyes unfocused. "You can't do this to me," he muttered, voice cracking. "I know things. I can help investigations. I can make deals." His words tumbled over one another, the bravado gone. "We can sort it out behind closed doors. For the sake of the city. For the sake of your reputation." "The law doesn't exist for my reputation," the governor replied. "And Dr. Price's living room is not a negotiation table." He tipped his head toward the major. "Take him into custody. Full charges: aggravated assault, elder abuse, corruption, operating an illegal storage facility in a protected building, and anything else our friends in the DA's office add." "Yes, sir." The major nodded once, then signaled to the two officers standing by the door. They moved forward with the smooth, quiet efficiency of professionals who had done this too many times to count. One took Dwayne's arm, the other his shoulders. He tried to twist away, but they were ready for it. In 3 motions, he was on his feet, wrists secured behind his back. The cuffs clicked shut with a final metallic certainty. "You can't let them take me," he screamed, now fully unraveling. "Tiana, say something. Mama Lorna, tell him I'm not a monster." The words echoed off the high ceiling, absurd in their desperation. "Enough," Governor Hale said, not turning around. "You've spoken more than enough for one evening." They dragged Dwayne toward the hallway. His feet barely found the floor as he struggled, then sagged, then simply hung between the two officers like a ruined coat. Just before they cleared the doorway, he twisted his head back for one last look at the dining room. His eyes locked onto Tiana. "Do something," he shouted. "You think you're safe now? You're not. You're." The front door shut behind them with a heavy, definitive thud. The sound rolled through the apartment like the closing of a vault. It was the same door he had thrown open 10 minutes earlier, grinning and joking about a notary and easy money. Now it had become a gate on his way to a radically different future. The guests stared at their plates or the tablecloth, desperate not to be noticed. Malik's hands were clenched into fists, so tight the knuckles stood out white against his dark skin. The woman from the office looked as if she might faint. None of them spoke. None of them reached for their phones. They understood instinctively that this was not an evening to document. "You will all be questioned as witnesses," Governor Hale said to them at last, his tone practical and unemotional. "For now, you may go. My staff will show you out." He didn't threaten them with retaliation or promise them protection. He simply stated a fact that seemed to unsettle them more than any shouted order would have. They rose with awkward haste, chairs scraping. They muttered polite phrases that fell flat before they reached anyone's ears and disappeared one by one down the hallway. When the apartment door closed again, this time softly, the dining room finally emptied of everyone except the 2 security officers, Tiana, Lorna, and the governor. Tiana remained on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes hollow. The posture made her look much younger than her age, not like a grown woman who had chosen silence, but like a child who had just discovered that adults were not invincible. "You cannot stay here tonight," the governor said to her, his tone returning to that of a man used to signing orders. "The investigation into your husband's activities has formally begun. You are, at minimum, a material witness. Given your awareness of the storage in the basement and your failure to report it, the district attorney will want to speak with you extensively. You'll be placed where you cannot interfere with Dr. Price's safety." "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered, staring at the pattern in the rug. "I don't have anywhere else. You'll be moved to a hotel under temporary supervision," he answered. One of my drivers is waiting downstairs. You'll pack what you need for a few days and leave tonight. Until the investigation is complete, you are not to approach your mother or attempt to contact her directly." Tiana turned her head toward Lorna, as if expecting her to argue, to beg the governor to soften the conditions. Waiting for the mother she remembered, the one who had always found a way to forgive late homework, missed curfews, sharp words said in adolescent anger. But the woman at the head of the table was not that mother. Not tonight. She was Dr. Price, who had spent decades making impossible decisions with steady hands. Lorna met her daughter's gaze. There was sorrow there, but no hesitation. "Pack your things," she said. "Do as they say." For a heartbeat, Tiana's face crumpled as if she might run forward and throw herself into her mother's arms. Instead, she pushed herself up awkwardly, legs stiff from kneeling, and walked toward the bedroom without another word. The sound of zippers and drawers opening drifted faintly down the hall, then the quiet rumble of a bag being dragged across the floor. When she returned, she paused in the doorway, a gym bag slung over her shoulder. She looked at her mother again, lips parting as if to speak, to apologize, to justify, to beg. But whatever words were forming withered. She swallowed them, lowered her gaze, and walked past the governor toward the foyer. Lorna did not follow her. The front door clicked shut with a soft, almost polite sound. This time there was no drama, no shouting, no threats. Just the small finality of a choice confirmed. For several minutes, no one spoke. The security officers moved quietly, gathering plates with professional efficiency, clearing away half-eaten food and sticky glasses and crumpled napkins as if resetting a stage for an entirely new performance. One opened the windows a crack, letting in cool night air. The smell of roast duck and spilled wine slowly thinned, replaced by the faint scent of city streets and damp stone. The grand table that had held so much tension now stood mostly bare. Only a few items remained, the hydrangeas in the center, their petals still bright, the red folder with the deed, closed and resting near Lorna's hand, and a small dessert plate with a slice of red velvet cake, untouched. A silver fork lay beside it, still clean. Lorna exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight she had carried on her lungs for years. The cast on her arm still throbbed painfully. The bruise beneath her skin still tingled. But inside, something lighter unfurled. The silence in the apartment no longer felt oppressive. It felt like the quiet after a storm, when the air is clearer than it has been in a very long time. "Leave us," Governor Hale told his men finally. "Wait in the car." They nodded and disappeared silently down the hall. He and Lorna remained alone in the room where her humiliation had bloomed and then been cut short. The governor poured tea from a pot one of his aides must have brought in during the cleanup. He filled 2 cups and placed one carefully in front of her. The steam curled up, carrying the familiar scent of strong leaves and lemon. Lorna wrapped her good hand around the warm porcelain. "Do you need anything else?" he asked gently once they had both taken a sip. "Medical care, a private nurse, a transfer to a facility where you'd be monitored around the clock? I can arrange any of it. Security patrols, alarms, whatever you say. No expense spared." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. In his lined face, she could still glimpse the young soldier who had once stared at her in fear as she prepared to open his skull. Then he trusted her hands. Now she trusted his power. That, too, was a form of surgery, she thought. He had excised something malignant from her life tonight. "There is one thing I need," she said slowly. Her eyes drifted to the small plate next to her cup. The red velvet cake, with its deep scarlet layers and white icing, looked almost festive in the otherwise cleared space. He followed her gaze and straightened slightly. "The cake?" he asked, clearly puzzled. "Shall I serve it for you?" "No," she replied, shaking her head. "Just slide the fork closer to me." His confusion deepened, but he obeyed. With a slight push, he moved the plate and the fork within easy reach of her left hand. She watched it come, the simple, ordinary motion loaded with meaning. "That man stood in this room and told everyone I couldn't even feed myself without him," she said quietly. He wanted me to believe it too. He wanted my world to shrink to whatever he decided to place on my plate. I need to prove him wrong. Not for him. For me. She picked up the fork with her non-dominant hand. The grip felt wrong at first, clumsy and unfamiliar. Age and stress made her fingers tremble, but she steadied them. Bit by bit, she lowered the fork into the cake and cut off a small piece. The frosting smeared under the prongs, leaving a soft white line against the red sponge. The governor watched without speaking. Lorna brought the bite to her mouth and tasted it. The sugar and cocoa and cream melted on her tongue. It was an ordinary cake, sweet, slightly dense, with just the right tang from the frosting. Yet it tasted like something entirely new. I am not helpless, she said after she swallowed. I am injured. That will heal. I am tired. That too passes. But helpless? No. I was a surgeon long before I was anyone's mother-in-law. Long before titles, favors, and politics. She set the fork down and folded her left hand around her teacup again. I have known for a long time that cutting out rot is sometimes the only way to save a body. I just needed the right assistant this time. Governor Hale's eyes softened. You did the hard part yourself, he replied. You made the call. You told the truth. All I brought was muscle and paperwork. Muscle and paperwork can be useful, she said, allowing herself a small, genuine smile. But you're wrong about one thing. I didn't tell the truth tonight just for myself. I told it for every woman of my generation who's been told she's too old, too confused, too dependent to be believed. The clock on the wall ticked steadily on. Tick, tock, tick, tock. This time, its sound did not feel like a countdown. It felt like a simple reminder. Time passes, and with it, everything that once claimed to be permanent. Later that night, when the hydrangeas had been placed in a clean vase and the red folder tucked safely into a drawer, Lorna sat alone at the same table, a notebook open in front of her. Her right arm was propped on a cushion, throbbing in time with her heartbeat, but her left hand moved steadily across the page. Words poured out, not in the clipped, precise phrases of a medical report, but in long sentences full of memory. She wrote not only about the broken bone and the doorbell and the man who knelt beside her. She wrote about years of small concessions, of overlooked snide remarks, of holidays where her name had been used for convenience but her presence was treated like an obligation. She described Tiana's transformation from the girl who used to fall asleep against her shoulder on bus rides home to a woman more afraid of embarrassment than of injury. Above the city, lights shimmered in the windows of other apartments, other homes with their own secrets, fights, and silences. Somewhere across town, Dwayne sat under very different lights, answering questions he could no longer dodge. His excuses would now be examined by people who had no interest in his status or his self-pity. Lorna set her pen down and flexed her fingers. Even that small motion sent a twinge up her forearm. She let the sensation wash through her. Pain, she knew from years of practice, was not always the enemy. Sometimes it was a sign that healing had begun. When she finally closed the notebook, she pushed her chair back and stood with care. The room felt bigger without Dwayne's blustering presence, without Tiana's nervous glances toward her husband. The air smelled faintly of tea and night, not of fear. She padded to the window and looked out at the street below. A car idled briefly as someone was dropped off, then moved on. Life continued in its ordinary way, oblivious to the small revolution that had taken place in her dining room. In the days that followed, the story spread, as stories do. Not every detail reached the outside world, and not everyone who heard it knew the names involved. But the core traveled. An elderly woman mistreated in her own home by those who owed her respect, a powerful man who remembered a debt and came when she called, a sudden, sharp turning of the tables. Some listeners shook their heads and said it served the culprits right. Others wondered if the punishment was too harsh. She threw her own daughter out, they murmured. She sent her son-in-law to prison. Isn't that going too far? Blood is blood. The arguments played out across kitchens and phones and comment sections, each person measuring the story against their own beliefs about loyalty and duty. Lorna understood those questions. She had asked them herself in quieter versions over the years, every time Tiana brushed off her concerns with a laugh and a quick change of subject, every time Dwayne's temper flared a little too bright and then was smoothed over with gifts and apologies. How much does a parent owe a child who has grown into someone they no longer recognize? When does protecting family become enabling harm? One evening, weeks later, she sat again at the head of her table, her cast replaced by a lighter brace. Her arms still ached, but she could move her hand more freely now. A new cake, simpler this time, a plain lemon loaf she had baked herself, rested in the center of the table. 2 cups of tea steamed on either side, one for her, one for the microphone she had set up a safe distance away. Her voice, when she began to speak, carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime explaining complex things. At a family dinner not so long ago, she began, I sat with a broken arm and an empty plate. The people eating at my table called it discipline. They called it a lesson. She smiled faintly, though no one could see her. They were right about one thing. It was a lesson, but not the one they thought. She told the story in measured detail, changing names and places but leaving the truth intact. She described the humiliating emptiness of that plate, the ache of her arm, the smell of food she could not reach. She painted Dwayne's boasting without lingering too long on his cruelty. She revealed Tiana's silence without turning her into a caricature. She told how she had called a man from her past, someone whose life she had once held between her fingers, and how he had answered without hesitation. She did not dwell on the arrest or the legal outcomes. Those belonged to a different system now, one that would grind forward with or without her attention. Instead, she focused on the night itself, the moment the governor knelt, the first bite of food after a day of hunger, the fork she held in her left hand, and the knowledge that she could still feed herself. At a certain point, she said into the microphone, you realize you're not just protecting your feelings. You're protecting your life. And sometimes, to save a life, even your own, you have to cut away what is poisoning it. That doesn't mean you stop loving the person you cut off. It means you start loving yourself enough not to let them keep hurting you. She knew some listeners would object. She knew some would say a mother must forgive anything, that children, no matter what they do, deserve endless second chances. She also knew that those opinions usually came from people who had never lain on a floor with a broken bone, while someone they raised chose silence over help. I chose myself, she finished quietly. I chose my dignity. I chose to believe my own pain and my own memory over someone else's convenient story. That was my operation. That was my cure. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Whether you think I was right or wrong, remember this much. No one, no spouse, no child, no in-law, has the right to convince you that you are helpless in your own home. She thanked her listeners and invited them, if the story resonated, to share where they were listening from. It truly warmed her to imagine other kitchens and living rooms, other people sipping tea or folding laundry while her voice reached them. Then she turned off the microphone, took another slice of her lemon cake, and ate it with her left hand. She did not hurry. She did not apologize. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked on, its steady rhythm filling the comfortable quiet. Time, which had once felt like an enemy counting down to humiliation, now marked something else. Long-earned freedom, and the life that would unfold after she had finally chosen to stop waiting for other people to change. Somewhere in the city, files with Dwayne's name on them sat in folders marked evidence. Somewhere else, Tiana sat in a small apartment she could afford on her own salary, staring at a phone she sometimes picked up but never quite had the courage to dial. Perhaps one day, Lorna thought, they might actually speak again, not as daughter and mother locked into old patterns, but as adults who had survived a brutal surgery on their relationship and lived to examine the scars. For now, though, the operation was complete. The infection was gone. The wound was still tender, but clean. Dr. Lorna Price sat in her own house, at her own table, with her own fork in her hand, and that, she thought, was more than enough.